Okay, I'm going to start with a short passage from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. And next time Jim told it, he said they rode him down to New Orleans. And after that, every time he told it, he spread it more and more, till by and by, he said they rode him all over the world and tired him most to death, and his back was all over saddle boils. Jim was monstrous proud about it, and he got so he wouldn't hardly notice the other niggers. Niggers would come miles to hear Jim tell about it, and he was more looked up to than any nigger in that country. Strange niggers would stand with their mouths open and look him all over, same as if he was a wonder. Niggers is always talking about witches in the dark by the kitchen fire, but whenever one was talking and letting on to know all about such things, Jim would happen in and say, what you know about witches? And that nigger was corked up and had to take a back seat. Jim always kept that 5-center piece around his neck with a string and said it was a charm the devil gave to him with his own hands, and told him he could cure anybody with it and fetch witches whenever he wanted to just by saying something to it, but he never told what it was he said to it. Niggers would come from all around there and give Jim anything they had just for sight of that 5-center piece, but they wouldn't touch it because the devil had had his hands on it. So just that short passage from The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, written in 1885 by Mark Twain, has the power to cause dissonance in the room. The word nigger is written 7 times just in that short passage. If this was read aloud in a high school English classroom, we would see looks of fear, of confusion, of pain, and maybe even of betrayal on the faces of the students. A racial epithet that has that much power to cause that much controversy in the classroom shouldn't be uttered, right? But who said that controversy in the classroom was a bad thing? For my senior project, I delved into the topic of disserving students by banning and censoring books, especially powerful literature in the United States. My name is Stephanie Tipple, and the title of my project is Who Are We Protecting? Disserving Students Through the Censoring and Banning of the Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. When I first began researching this topic, I knew 2 things for sure. First, that I loved The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn for the thoughts that it provoked and the way it made me look at my racist society in which I live. And second, I knew that talking about controversial issues in the classroom was important, I just didn't know how to prove it. And then I found this quote, and it proved to be my relief. Helen Fox, the author of When Race Breaks Out, quotes a young student who said that she believes that change cannot be made through having safe and superficial chit-chat. Getting uncomfortable and passionate turns into reform. Sometimes in order to be heard, you need to be raw and you need to be honest. At this point in my research, I found comfort in this quote, and I decided to make a vow with myself and my future students that I would be raw and I would be honest in the classroom. I decided that I would overcome this barrier built by a whitewashed society that says that I, as a future white teacher, am not allowed to talk about race or lead discussions of racism in my classroom. So why is my research important? Because we live in a society that is full of racism. Racism never disappeared along with the abolition of slavery, contrary to popular belief. Literature has the power to remind us of the terrible and horrible things that happen in our world. And as a white teacher, taking the privilege that I have in deciding not to discuss race in my classroom would be to disserve my students on the discussion of such a real and raw issue in their world. To deny that we live with racism is to deny our students an education that can empower them to change the world in which they live. So let's begin with the controversy of Huck Finn. This is an example of powerful literature that I was talking about. Written and published in 1885, as I previously mentioned, the novel was banned from the beginning, and one of the first places to ban Huck Finn was the Concord Free Public Library in Massachusetts. However, their reason for banning the book is really interesting. They banned it for the language of rough dialect, the systematic use of bad grammar, and coarse expressions. So the librarian who spoke on behalf of the Concord Free Public Library goes on to say, the whole book is of a class that is more profitable for the slums than it is for respectable people, and it is trash of the various sort. This was the proposed reason for banning the book in 1885. What is interesting is that the reason for the censoring and banning controversy today is because of the use of the racial epithet within the novel, and it is written 219 times throughout the entire work. The New South Publishing Company actually changed the word nigger to slave with the intentions of protecting black students. However, I pose the following questions. Who are we really protecting? Are we protecting our students of color who are forced to deal with the effects of racism on a day-to-day basis? Or are we protecting our white teachers from having to feel the discomfort of talking about race? So through my research, I wanted to prove how important it is to talk about race in the classroom. And I began with one of my most influential mentors here at the University of Mount Union, Dr. Jennifer L. Martin. And I began with her article published in the Urban Review called Critical Race Theory, Hip Hop and Huck Finn, Narrative Inquiry in a High School English Classroom. This article was my driving force. It was my guide throughout my research. Dr. Martin, an English teacher in an alternative school before coming here to UMU, describes her journey teaching Huck Finn in a diverse classroom. The article talks about her struggles and her hardships while teaching the controversial novel. However, throughout the entire essay, she stays strong in her belief that when white teachers, however well-intentioned, avoid addressing topics pertaining to race, it only serves to stifle the voices of students of color. I read this article a few times during my college career, and I like to say that it was my inspiration for my research. This article sparked my choices on my further readings of the literature on the topic of talking about race in the classroom. I knew at this point that I wanted to educate myself further on how, as a white teacher, to overcome the idea of white privilege, to provide my students with the best education about race. So I continued with my research and my reading. So let's talk about the literature that I have read. I want to show you my most influential sources and talk about the themes that I have pulled out from each book that have really helped to inform my research. It is important to point out, however, that research on the topic of race in the classroom is endless. And there's no set way or best practice to teaching race, and I learned this while I was researching. But all of the works that I have read, whether deeming controversial literature in the classroom as right or wrong, have in one way or another influenced my research. One of the most important books that pertained to my research was the book by Helen Fox called When Race Breaks Out, Conversations about Race and Racism in the College Classrooms. Now, I talked about this book previously. This was the book that helped me to realize that I am not alone in this fear and this discomfort of teaching race and leading discussions of race in the classroom. Fox seconds Dr. Martin's idea that teaching race from a white teacher's perspective may cause discomfort, but it is important to overcome that discomfort in order to serve our students. She also delves into the topic of Eurocentrism and ethnocentrism and how it is important in order to talk about race to overcome these adversities in the classroom. Eurocentrism is the idea that Europe is the center of all that is worthy to talk about, all that is worthy to aspire to. And ethnocentrism is the stripping of ethnic identity of people of color because it is not white ethnicity, and it is not the idea that white is right. Most schools are bogged down by these issues within curriculum, such as teaching canonical works from only white male authors, or only teaching white American studies and history courses. Fox proposes that in order to get rid of Eurocentrism and ethnocentrism, we need to provide our students with a multicultural education. The next source that really informed my research was We Can't Teach What We Don't Know, White Teachers, Multiracial Schools by Gary R. Howard. This book helped me to understand how students develop racially, or how they develop in the understanding of the racism that is in their world. This is called racial identity development, and there are steps in both black racial identity development as well as steps in white racial identity development. Understanding these steps is critical in the classroom because we must set goals for racial development in all of our students, no matter where they begin, as well as in ourselves as teachers, in order to successfully discuss race in the classroom. And it is also imperative to understand that there is no end to racial development. None of us will ever be fully racially evolved, but we can constantly work towards reform, we can constantly work towards change. Howard suggests that in order to develop, we must talk about race in the classroom, or there will be no room for development of racial identity. The last source that was influential to me is called Raising Race Questions, Whiteness and Inquiry in Education by Allie Michael. This book allowed me the realization that in order to make a change, we have to allow our students a say in their education. And I put this in terms of Huck Finn. In order to teach it in the classroom, the students must first be educated on the controversy, and discussions of race must take place before the novel is even introduced. This book also informed me on the topic of critical race theory, which is how a student looks at race. By using critical race theory in the classroom, the students are given the opportunity to think about racism and their lives critically and to apply it to the lessons provided by the literature, like Huck Finn. Allie Michael also informed her readers about culturally responsive pedagogy. This is the idea that teachers must look at students' backgrounds and base lessons on where they are in their racial identity development. This is the gaining the knowledge about one's students that is necessary for the classroom. Rather than forcing a student to assimilate to the culture of the school, we need to give the students the empowerment to shape the culture of the school in which they belong. So now I would like to talk about the roadblocks of my research because these were really important. As mentioned before, there's a lot of literature on the topic of talking about race in the classroom, especially critics of teaching race in the classroom. One of the critics that almost influenced me to change my topic is Sharon E. Rush. When I first began my research, Rush was the writer that made me question whether or not my stance on teaching race in the classroom was right or wrong. These arguments that I am about to show you caused me to stumble and fall. A couple of months ago, I would have never had the confidence to counter these arguments. However, with help from my senior project professor, Dr. Colin Sibley, and my fellow students, I realized that my research was important, that it could really help to make a difference. So I continued to educate myself, and I'm proud to say today I can successfully counter Sharon E. Rush's arguments. So let's start first with her argument about emotional segregation in the classroom. She tells a story about how in one classroom that taught the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, the teacher asked her students what the word nigger meant. The white students then proceeded to turn around and look at the black students in the classroom. She compares this to the segregation that took place in legally segregated schools, as well as in railroad cars in the past. She implies that segregation is still taking place in the classroom, but only when we talk about race. When I first read this, I asked myself, now how can I counter that? Who am I as a future white teacher to say that my black students will not feel tension when talking about race with their white peers? But today I can counter this by saying that there's already an obvious race problem in this classroom. By these white students intuitively turning around and looking at their black peers, there is already an issue of race. It's just not talked about. This shows that talking about it is important because it is real and it is raw and it has not disappeared. This is also why we must use critical race theory and culturally responsive pedagogy in the classroom, because it is important that these discussions take place before the teaching of the controversial novels such as Huck Finn. The next argument that Rush provides is that children ages 11 through 17 should not be subjected to the use of the word nigger within Huck Finn because they are far less able to contextualize the use of the epithet or control their emotional responses to it. What I find interesting about this argument is that Rush never thought about the fact that children that age are more likely within their social lives to be introduced to the racial epithet than adults are. In fact, students hear this word every day, whether in the hallways with the word nigga, in rap songs, or even from racist family members who use the epithet. If we allow students the chance to learn these words without contextualizing how powerful they actually are, we allow racism to continue in the United States. So throughout my research, and to summarize what I have learned, I have realized the importance of teaching race in the classroom. And I've learned from different teachers' stories the negative effects of ignoring race and racism in the classroom. I learned that it's important to own up to the racism that exists in our world and to work towards a racial identity development that provides for comfort in talking about race in the classroom. I have learned the importance of dismantling white privilege and the idea that because I am white, I have the privilege to decide not to talk about race in the classroom. I have learned to overcome the barrier that is built by a whitewashed society that says that because I am white, I have no right to discuss racial issues with my students. Literature has the power to change the world, and I am a firm believer of that. Racism still exists today because we live in a perpetually racist society. At this point, it is not our goal to delete racism, but it is important to talk about it, and that's the first step, in order to maybe someday watch our students reach an anti-racist society. If we decide to stifle the voices of our students, we will continue to allow the racism elephant in the room to get bigger and bigger until it bursts. We must empower our students through literature, such as The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and through controversy to become the change they wish to see in the world. Thank you.